foundation.
American Perspectives is next. This edition begins with the debate on affirmative action between author Dinesh D'Souza and law professor Frank Wu. And in about an hour and 45 minutes, Congressman J.C. Watts speaks to the Republican Party of Iowa about party politics. American Perspectives, our weekly look at the cultural and historical side of American politics. We begin with a debate on affirmative action. Author Dinesh D'Souza and law professor Frank Wu took part in this forum last month at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. Mr. D'Souza is the author of 3 books, including The End of Racism and a recent biography of Ronald Reagan. Mr. Wu teaches in the Clinical Law Center Elder Law Program at Howard University in Washington, D.C.
Let's begin. We have 2 extremely gifted and intelligent speakers. I myself have seen them in action before, and as you will see, each of them is a person of remarkable character. Professor Frank Wu did his undergraduate work at Johns Hopkins and received a law degree from the University of Michigan. He has taught at Stanford University Law School and is now teaching at Howard University School of Law. His academic articles in law journals include Neither Black Nor White, Asian Americans and Affirmative Action, and The Limits of Borders, a moderate proposal for immigration reform. Professor Wu has testified against legislation that would abolish affirmative action and federal government contracting. He writes on a regular basis for the New York Times Syndicate and Asian Week. His work has appeared in the Washington Post, the Chronicle of Higher Education, and World Journal. Professor Wu. Dinesh D'Souza graduated Phi Beta Kappa from Dartmouth College. He has been a senior domestic policy analyst in the White House during the Reagan administration. Mr. D'Souza is a John M. Olin Foundation Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington. He doesn't like Washington, but he lives there. He said not to like Washington. Mr. D'Souza's book, Ronald Reagan, How an Ordinary Man Became an Extraordinary Leader, will be published by the Free Press in November of '97. I have a copy here. He told me that the photograph on the cover looks like John Wayne, which in some ways is a theme of the book. I think he's right, for better or worse. Mr. D'Souza has been featured. Mr. D'Souza is the author also of a New York Times bestseller called Illiberal Education, The Politics of Race and Sex on Campus, and also another book called The End of Racism. Mr. D'Souza has been featured on numerous programs, including This Week with David Brinkley, the McNeil-Lehrer NewsHour, Nightline, Crossfire, Firing Line, and Good Morning America. Mr. D'Souza. This is our format for this evening. I shall introduce each speaker in turn. First, Mr. D'Souza will speak for 15 minutes. Then, Professor Wu will speak for 15 minutes. Mr. D'Souza will then reply for 5, and Professor Wu will reply for 5. At that point, the debate begins, and I'll be asking you and inviting you to ask questions. At the end, I'll invite each of the speakers to give us some closing remarks. Without further ado, Dinesh D'Souza.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I see this is a wide podium. I guess I didn't have to wear pants. I was very touched to see the protesters outside. I'm delighted to be at Brown. What is Brown University without a few protesters? And I think people watching this show on C-SPAN will be delighted to hear that there are still international socialists around somewhere. I know those guys have been in a somewhat irritable mood ever since the Berlin Wall fell. I must tell you that, as you know, the subject of my new book is Reagan, and when Reagan was governor in the 60s, a very tumultuous time in California. There were protests at Berkeley, San Francisco State, and Reagan was constantly accosted by activists who would try to shout at him, blockade him, surround his limousine. And in the 60s, in the late 60s, he was once traveling in his limousine. A group of protesters surrounded the limousine, and they held up signs saying, "We are the future." And Reagan kind of looked at this and scribbled his own reply on a piece of paper and held it up, and it said, "I'll sell my bonds." Now, I'm here to talk about the very difficult or the very challenging topic of race. Affirmative action sometimes involves both race and gender, but I'm going to focus my remarks on the debate surrounding race, partly for a reason stated some years ago by, of all people, Gerald Ford. He said there will never be a war between the sexes because there has simply been too much fraternizing with the enemy. Gender is a serious issue, but it doesn't, it seems to me, have the same prospects for social balkanization or social division as does race. Now, we are at a critical turning point in the affirmative action debate. We see that in California, at the University of California at Berkeley, at the University of Texas Law School. We are seeing that the imposition of colorblind laws, of laws requiring a colorblind admissions policy, are leading to a quite dramatic decline in the number of black and Hispanic students. And many of the defenders of affirmative action, in a sense having run out of other arguments, are now saying, look at this result, look at the diminution of the percentage of blacks and Hispanics at Berkeley. Are you willing to live with these outcomes? And what I want to do today in my opening statement is make the case for why we should answer to that question a reluctant yes. The debate surrounding affirmative action hinges crucially on what affirmative action is and how it works or doesn't work. Recently at the University of California at Berkeley, I approached the director of admissions and posed to him this question. I said, imagine the case of a student applying to this fine university who has a grade average in high school of B+ to A- and an SAT score of about 1,200 out of 1,600. In other words, a good student. And I said, if this student happens to be, let us say, Hispanic, what is the probability that he or she would be admitted to Berkeley? And he replied, the probability would be 100%. Student would be guaranteed admission. And I said, fine. Now imagine the case of a student who has the same grades, the same test scores, and the same extracurricular talent. But like me, the student is of Asian descent. What would be the odds that this same student would be offered admission to Berkeley? And he said the chance of that would be approximately 5%. In other words, what Berkeley has been doing, and many universities, including Brown, is practicing aggressive forms of racial preference in its admissions policy. Now, if you were to approach the admissions director at Brown and ask him, why are you doing this? Why do you have preferential policies that judge people not on the content of their character, not on their academic preparation, but primarily or decisively on their race? He would probably reply, or she would probably reply, that's because America has a long history of discrimination, a history that continues to this very day, and a history that I will admit is undeniable. And affirmative action is necessary at Brown to fight discrimination. And then you may ask the following question. If that is true, if students applying to Brown are facing discrimination, where is that discrimination? Are there racists in the admissions office at Brown who are trying to keep Hispanics and blacks out? Are you, sir, you can ask the admissions director, a racist yourself? Are you the problem? And the answer is no. No one even alleges this. No one claims that there are bigots in the Berkeley admissions office or in the Texas admissions office. So what then is the problem? Let me suggest that what the problem is that at Brown, at Berkeley, many other universities, equality of rights for individuals is not leading to equality of results for groups. In other words, what we are now seeing is that merit is creating some of the same inequality that racism used to create. And this is convincing many advocates of affirmative action that merit itself is a racist concept. And that's why, for example, you now have all these schools saying, well, maybe we should get rid of the tests. Maybe we should eliminate the standardized tests. Not because of any inherent defect in the test, but because the test is not giving us a result that we want. Now, let us say that what Berkeley and Brown and many universities are trying to do is to have a racially preferential policy to have a diverse student body. It nevertheless remains true that these policies have certain undeniable effects, and I would like to focus briefly on two. The first effect is what I will call the racial effect, and that is that these policies tend to intensify and exacerbate racial consciousness and racial intoxication in our society. A generation after Martin Luther King's death, we are an ever more racialized society. Very difficult to go through life without checking little boxes all the time on which you are asked to specify your race and in which your race will make a decisive difference. And the question is, do you want to continue to live in that kind of society? Now, I concede that when affirmative action policies were first established in the 60s, in the late 60s, many Americans supported them because they felt that something needed to be done to kick in the door of the old segregation. Something needed to be done specifically for blacks because blacks had suffered a history of slavery, of segregation. And so affirmative action was intended for blacks. And what happened a little bit later is many other groups showed up at the multicultural picnic. And they said, you had the Hispanic groups, you had the gay rights groups, the women's groups, and they basically said, we too are victims of discrimination. We demand preferential treatment too. And if you look at the history, you will see that the black leaders in the 60s at first said, forget it. Can you advance a comparable claim of historical discrimination compared to ours? No. But then a second thought dawned to them. And this thought was this: even though the admission of these other groups onto the affirmative action bandwagon might weaken the moral case for affirmative action, it will strengthen the political coalition that will keep these programs going indefinitely, if not forever. In other words, as long as it was just blacks, blacks were reliant on white goodwill to keep these programs going. But if you allow women, gays, other groups to come in, then perhaps you can knit together a 51% coalition. And the effect of this, the consequence of this, has been to strengthen the political support for affirmative action, but I think fatally to weaken its moral foundation. And so we now are at a situation where the son or daughter of Jesse Jackson, who went to private school in the Washington, D.C. area, would get preference to get into Brown over the son of a white postman. We now have it the case that immigrants from Barbados or Bombay qualify for certain jobs or government contracts denied to native-born whites. Now, can any reasonable person defend these forms of bias, these forms of preference? Justice Blackmun said in the Bakke case that in order to make people equal, we have to treat them differently. In order to get beyond race, we've got to take race into account. This, it seems to me, is a central contradiction surrounding affirmative action. Now, I mentioned earlier that the problem is not so much discrimination today as merit. And let me put it this way. It is now the case that on virtually every measure of academic achievement or economic performance, you think of a measure. Think of a test in any subject and administer it to 100 randomly selected whites, blacks, Hispanics, and Asians in the United States today, in any part of the country at any age. And I will tell you in advance the result. Asians and whites will do the best, Hispanics will fall in the middle, African Americans will do the least well. I said on virtually every measure. And I assure you that in the national debate surrounding this issue, I have not found, no one has been able to give me one counterexample to this pattern. And my point is, merit is creating inequality. Let me give you one statistic that you should think about and think hard about. And that's this. On the SAT, which most of you, if not all of you, have taken, on the Scholastic Assessment Test, verbal and math section both, Asians and whites who come from families making less than $15,000 a year score higher on the test every year than African Americans who come from families earning over $60,000 a year. Now think about that, because if you're going to sit around and tell me the test merely measures socioeconomic privilege, how do you account for that result? If you're going to tell me that the test measures racism, I say to you that perhaps the verbal section of the test may be biased. It measures synonyms and antonyms, and that depends on where you grew up, perhaps. Forget it. Throw out the verbal section of the test. Ignore it. Focus only on the math section. Can anyone tell me with a straight face that equations are racially biased? And if not, if the math section of the test is manifestly not biased, why are poor whites and Asians doing better on math tests than upper middle class blacks? This is the heart of the American dilemma, and it is the fact that the advocates of affirmative action are in denial about. That merit creates inequality, and it is merit that has now come under assault. Now, why does merit create inequality? I'm not arguing for a minute, and in fact in my book I argue against the notion that there is some kind of natural or biological or genetic factor involved. No. What I am arguing is that there are, if you will, cultural or behavioral differences between groups. These differences are observable in everyday life. They are measurable by the techniques of social science. They can be directly correlated with academic achievement and economic performance. I'll give you one example. A professor at Stanford named Dornbush was very puzzled about an assertion in the bell curve that Asian American students are doing better in California because perhaps they are naturally better at math. And so what he did is a comparative study looking at students from different ethnic groups. And he concluded that there is a very counterintuitive reason for why Asian Americans do better. And that is that Asian Americans study harder. On average, he found Asian American students in high school spend about 12 hours a week studying, compared to about 7 or 8 hours for white students and even less for Hispanic and black students. My point is, if this is true, let's pause it for a moment, it's true. You might ask me why. Why do Asian American students study harder? I don't know entirely, but I can suggest one factor, and that would be family structure. On average, it is probably true that in a two-parent family, you have more attention, more time to impose discipline, make your young kids study, than in a single-parent family. This would seem to be obvious. What is the illegitimacy rate in the Asian American community? 2 to 3%. What about in the African American community? 70%. These are huge, huge differences. And my point is, once we begin to concede the truth of this, we then begin to get to what can be best done about it. And what can be best done about it is to basically say, how can we tackle the problems of terrible public schools, of lousy neighborhoods, of graffiti on the walls, of broken families, of gangs? These factors are leading to different levels of preparation for students who apply to Brown. Affirmative action is a very cosmetic It's a non-solution. It basically says we're going to solve the problem of different levels of academic preparation by having a race in which we draw a straight line and ask Fred, you start 10 yards ahead. Jane, you start 3 yards behind. Is that a fair race? No, it's a race that's been rigged. Now, so I'll be happy later on to talk about solutions, of which I have quite a few. But let me conclude on this note. Many years ago, Martin Luther King said, and I'm not going to quote the line that you're thinking of about the content of our character. Martin Luther King said, "Every man ultimately must write with his own hand the charter of his Emancipation Proclamation." And what he meant by this is that in a free society, we have the right to ask, we have the right to demand that the government give us equality of rights under the law. But we do not have the right to demand any more than that. What we do with those rights, what we make of our destiny, the script we write of our lives, that ultimately is up to us. Thank you.
Professor Wu.
Thank you. I stand before you today as a proud beneficiary of affirmative action. And I believe that is true of many of us in this room. And I urge all of us to reflect on the ways in which we have benefited from privileges of which we are conscious and those of which we are unaware, rather than seeking to attack our fellow citizens, neighbors, and friends who would seek to share in the good fortune which we enjoy. Unfortunately, I'm not nearly as funny as Dinesh D'Souza, but thankfully I'm also not nearly as inflammatory. I'd like to share with you a different vision. A vision of a society in which there is true equality of opportunity, in which we all belong as equals. And in my talk today, I will focus on 5 points. First, true principles. Second, real problems. Third, pragmatic solutions. Fourth, what is wrong with everything Dinesh D'Souza has just said. Fifth, and finally, some fallacies which we are all too eager, I believe, all of us, to believe. Fallacies of colorblindness and meritocracy, which once exposed, show us how each and every one of us, in our own way, is color conscious and benefits from that color consciousness. Let me begin, though, by acknowledging that affirmative action is a difficult subject. And let me acknowledge that we are ambivalent as a society, and that it is right to be ambivalent. And let me also acknowledge that Dinesh D'Souza, for all of his faults, at least claims to offer you principles. I believe, however, that his principles are the wrong ones. And I would suggest that whatever else we do in this debate, that we not fall prey to accusations and name-calling in which we believe that there is bad faith on one side or on all sides or merely self-interest. I believe, rather, that the affirmative action debate, properly framed, is one of principle, one of vision, one of civil rights, one in which we articulate what it is that we hold dear, what type of society we would hold as ideal. And I think the difference between me and Dinesh D'Souza is that I reject the idea that the University of California at Berkeley or the University of Texas or Brown University can end up somehow all white or almost all white or almost exclusively all white and Asian American and have that be an acceptable result. I think, simply put, that is wrong. And that is a principle for which I will stand. And I ask all of you to ask those who debate this issue, what are the principles for which they stand? And I believe that affirmative action all too often is described by its opponents as merely a matter of ethnic group self-interest. Let me make clear today, then, that I support affirmative action regardless of whether I stand to benefit. I support affirmative action regardless of whether Asian Americans are included. I support affirmative action because I believe its benefits are great, its costs minimal, and that it is good for society as a whole. And I urge all of you to ask, as you hear people speak in this debate, what are the principles for which they stand? And the principles for which I stand are genuine equality of opportunity and no exclusion on a systematic basis of racial minority groups. Let me then turn to my second point, the real problem. I think those of us who support affirmative action have made a mistake. We've been willing to engage in this debate about whether affirmative action makes sense, instead of forcing the other side to engage in the real debate. We should begin this debate not with affirmative action, not with so-called reverse discrimination, but with regular racial discrimination. Not as an academic matter, not as a historical matter, but as something which is concrete and which is contemporary and which affects the day-to-day lives of millions of people in this country, primarily racial minorities. This racial discrimination, which can be documented time and again today in housing segregation, in employment opportunities, in police brutality, in court cases, in the day-to-day experiences with which each and every one of you are familiar. This is the real problem. And the challenge before us is not what we should do about affirmative action. The challenge before us is what will we do about this urgent crisis which we have faced since the founding of this nation and which we face today still, the crisis of racial discrimination. And let me say that I acknowledge it is entirely possible in an isolated case for a white male to be a victim of racial discrimination. But by any serious social science measure, most of the cases of racial discrimination today still concern racial minorities on the receiving end of that prejudice. Let me give you an example. I urge you to look at the bipartisan Federal Glass Ceiling Commission report, chaired by Mrs. Elizabeth Dole and written by Fortune 500 corporate executives, in which they find that 95 to 97% of upper-level management positions at Fortune 500 companies and board directorships are held by white men. This is not to say that the white men are not qualified. It is to say that others are as well. And it is not to say, as Dinesh D'Souza suggested, that there is a single racist wrongdoer at each of these Fortune 500 companies denying promotions and opportunities and employment to racial minorities. It is to say, rather, we all carry around stereotypes. Our culture has those stereotypes. There are structural barriers. There are serious issues of economic equality that are correlated to race. And all of these together are what explains this result, and this result must be addressed if we are to share in a vision of a society which is equitable and fair and just. And I think when you look at the Fortune 500 companies, when you look at any of these social science measures, what you find is that affirmative action makes sense because it does not force us to identify a single racist wrongdoer. It acknowledges, rather, the guilt that we all share. Let me turn to the third point of pragmatic alternatives. I think in discussing affirmative action, the burden falls on those who would abolish it. For affirmative action is just a hodgepodge of remedies for racial discrimination. And ironically, affirmative action is supported, has been supported by presidents of both political parties, by major companies, and at all levels of society. It has been supported because it is actually a rather moderate solution. And it is a solution which works. It is not all that we can do. Indeed, I believe we should do much more. But let me point to a specific example, and I'll leave my my fourth and fifth points for later in tonight's talk. But let me point to a specific example, and that is of the United States military. No one would believe that the United States military is a leftist organization. Few would hold that it is even especially progressive on race matters. But the United States military is an example of affirmative action at work. It has a highly aggressive affirmative action program which has made it the most integrated workforce in the world. It is unquestionably color conscious in its recruitment, in its retention, in its training, and its promotion. It has goals, it has timetables, it keeps track of people. But it is done so in a way that does not involve quotas, does not involve different standards, and which, although it is principally intended to and does benefit African Americans, it also benefits everyone in the military and all of us by making the military more effective. The United States military is an example where affirmative action has worked. And if it works in an institution as conservative and hidebound as the military, I would suggest to you that it will work elsewhere as well. And it may accomplish even better results. Let me conclude in my opening statements by suggesting that what we seek here is to reach out to everyone and to develop standards and civil rights principles which we can all believe in, which speak to all of us, for all of us, and about all of us. And the principles which Mr. D'Souza offers are those which should appeal to you only if you believe in a rigid meritocracy that you would prevail. Most of us, I believe, not having had 4-point grade averages and 1600s on our SAT, would find ourselves far worse off under the social Darwinist scheme which he envisions. Leaving my last 2 points for later, let me conclude in these introductory remarks by saying to you that it is not Dinesh D'Souza who must be stopped, it is the rest of us who must be started. That this debate about racial justice and affirmative action, which you see waged in California and in Congress, and which you hear about every day, and in which some people suggest to you that affirmative action is dead and over, that this debate has only begun. This is a struggle about racial justice. It is a struggle in which we all must take part.
Yeah. 5 minutes now of rebuttal. Mr. D'Souza.
Well, Professor Wu is funnier than he gives himself credit for. I counted, I think, 3 errors of fact and several errors of logic in his opening remarks. Frank, for 15 minutes, that's accomplishing quite a bit. I don't know how to begin my rebuttal. I feel a little bit like the mosquito at the nudist colony. I'm not sure where to begin. But let me begin. Let me begin with this disputed notion about merit, or as Professor Wu says, a rigid meritocracy. Look, I'm quite aware that merit is a very fallible concept. Our president is a Rhodes Scholar. I rest my case. Let me tell you a little story. Let me tell you a little story about a C student from Eureka, Ronald Reagan, who went back to his alma mater in the mid-'80s. And he was asked, isn't it true that you graduated with a C average? And President Reagan replied, yes, and even now I sometimes wonder what I might have accomplished if I had studied harder. So Reagan was confident about himself despite his weak grades. True. Nevertheless, academic institutions must use some measure of merit. No one is saying it should be limited to grades or test scores. You can consider extracurricular talents, but whatever measure you use, what I'm arguing is it should be used in a race-neutral manner. Now, Professor Wu focuses on the problem of discrimination. He says the problem isn't affirmative action. The problem is plain, old-fashioned, regular discrimination. Fine. But the question I have for him is that do we effectively, as a society, fight discrimination by practicing it? This seems to be the paradox of affirmative action. The criticism of affirmative action is not based on a denial of discrimination, but the denial of using discrimination as a technique to outlaw discrimination. I argue that that's contradictory. That creates two cases of discrimination. Remember, it's a fundamental principle of justice that when someone has been wronged, you find the guy who has been wronged, benefit him. And you find the guy that did the injustice and make him pay. If I was walking on the street and a car came on the sidewalk, ran over my foot, I have been wronged. But the fact is, would it be a fair remedy for me to set up a booth and collect $25 from every subsequent car that came by? This would be ridiculous. If I want to have a claim, I've got to find the guy who ran over my foot and make a case against him. The point is, can you tell me that any of the Asian, American, and white students who are turned away from Berkeley with better grades and better test scores, even though many of them come from poor families, can you tell me that any of them have been discriminating against anyone? Why should they pay the price? If there are discriminators at Brown, find them and fire them. Why do you make innocent students pay? Moreover, are any of the black or Hispanic students who get into Brown or get into Berkeley on a preferential basis, have they been victimized by the university? In other words, we have developed a very crude system of social justice. Now, Professor Wu says, I don't want to have a university that's all white. He was very crafty in what he said, because the fact is at Berkeley, and even here at Brown, we are not faced with that prospect. We have two choices: a merit system in which Brown might well be 40% Asian, maybe 40% white, maybe 6% Hispanic, maybe 2% black. That is one choice. And that is a multiracial campus, I assure you. But it's a multiracial campus built upon the principle of merit. The other choice is a preferential system. A preferential system. Now, I tell you this. It is a fact in American society. It is a fact in American society that some groups, and I mentioned two, Asian Americans and Jews, are overrepresented by a huge factor vis-a-vis their numbers. Jews are in this country about 3% of the population, 20 to 25% of many elite school campuses. Asian Americans, the same story. Now, it is a fact that you cannot reduce the number of you cannot raise the number of underrepresented groups without simultaneously reducing the number of overrepresented groups. And so when you have preferential policies that let in groups that don't do well, you're going to have preferential policies that discriminate against groups that do well. And so one question for Professor Wu is, what does he say to the Jewish student or to the Asian student who has good grades, who has good test scores, who has strong extracurriculars, but is turned away from Brown for no fault other than the color of their skin? I would like him to try to answer that question. I seem like I'm almost out of time, so let me conclude on this point. Every time you open up a Brown catalog, you see on the back, Brown University does not discriminate based upon race, based upon gender, based upon national origin, and so on. I think we've established today this statement is a clinical falsehood. It is true that in this country there is a problem of discrimination. But I rest my case on the notion that if we want to get rid of race as a factor in decision-making, the best way to do that is simply to get rid of race as a factor in decision-making. Thank you.
Professor Wu.
Thank you again. Let me respond directly to two challenges put to me. First, I think that Mr. D'Souza is attempting to fool you by equating morally affirmative action with regular racial discrimination. Consider the following two cases. In 1950, when Heman Sweat, an African-American individual, applied to the University of Texas Law School, he was turned down immediately and for no reason other than his race. He had to sue, and he went all the way up to the Supreme Court before the court in a case before the Brown versus Board of Education case was decided, before the Supreme Court announced that separate but equal was okay, and thus the state of Texas established a law school in the basement of an apartment building with no faculty and no library and no books and no students other than this one individual who had prevailed in the lawsuit. That is racial discrimination. Contrast that with the situation before the Hopwood decision came down at the University of Texas Law School in, say, 1995, when it was practicing affirmative action. At that point, when Cheryl Hopwood applied, She was indeed turned down. But she was not turned down for the same reason that Heman Sweat was turned down. She was not turned down solely because of her race. We know that because if you look at University of Texas, despite modest increases in the number of Hispanics and African Americans, it remains an overwhelmingly white institution. Cheryl Hopwood did not suffer the same harm of racial discrimination. Indeed, 100 white students were admitted with lower grades and test scores than Cheryl Hopwood. But neither she nor the right-wing organizations which backed her protested the admission of those white students. They cared instead only about affirmative action. Ask yourself, if merit is what matters, why not the 100 white students who got in ahead of Cheryl Hopwood? Second example. Mr. D'Souza asked me to respond to the problem of overrepresentation of certain racial minority groups. He here engages in the classic tactic of divide and conquer. It is true that if you have affirmative action, there will be costs. If those costs are distributed equally among society, they will not single out Asian Americans, nor will they single out Jewish students. However, if you operated an affirmative action program which was unconstitutional and improper, and which worked in the following manner, that for every African American you admitted, you simply denied admission to an Asian American, thus a tit-for-tat scenario, which was divide and conquer, and which represented the worst possible form, not of affirmative action, but of regular racial discrimination, then you would have the situation which Mr. D'Souza describes. Let me briefly now turn to his book. And don't let his moderation here tonight fool you. I urge you, go to the library and take out his book. Don't buy it, you would be supporting his cause. Open it to any page and you'll find assertions along the lines of, and don't believe necessarily what I say, check these for yourself, as I'm sure he would insist that you do. You'll find assertions such as, slavery was not a racist institution because many African Americans themselves owned slaves, such as slaves here in the United States were better off than they would have been in Africa, such as that the only people who deserve compensation for slavery are slaves, and as he put it, and this is an exact quote, the slaves are dead. Now this, I suggest you, represents Mr. D'Souza's true colors. And look at his proposals. For he would have us abolish not only affirmative action, but this is important, read the book. He would have us abolish anti-discrimination laws altogether. He would make it legal and proper and moral and legitimate for institutions to discriminate on the basis of race. That, I think, is what represents his views. And abolishing affirmative action is merely one step toward that ultimate goal, which he lays out quite clearly in The End of Racism. And understand, too, that Mr. D'Souza does not stand here to advocate for colorblindness as a moral principle. For in The End of Racism, he also defends what he terms rational discrimination, whereby if a stereotype is more or less true, then it is morally legitimate to be prejudiced, to draw inferences on the basis of a person's racial background. That, I think, is what makes his views about affirmative action disingenuous, because they are part and parcel of an all-out attack on the civil rights movement and all of its accomplishments, which, mind you, have benefited not merely African Americans, but all of us, society as a whole. And that is why I think affirmative action must be supported, not because it is the best solution, not because it is the only solution, but because to repeal affirmative action without offering an alternative would be unconscionable. And if the alternative is nothing more than the operation of the mythical free market in sorting out discrimination, so that the individual who is discriminated against in seeking an apartment, that if they're African American, they need not worry because they can just go down the block and find the other apartment owner who discriminates against whites. If you believe that that is the system which will work to eradicate racial discrimination, let me suggest to you that you go and try to rent an apartment. Thank you.
Well, there's a thing called moderator's prerogative. I shall exercise it. briefly. I just had a question for each of the speakers. First, for Mr. D'Souza. I'm puzzled by your main argument, if I understand it. It seems to me to rest squarely on a premise that you did not defend. So I thought I'd give you a chance to defend that premise. You say that equality of rights for individuals does not lead to equality of results for groups. And then, premise, you explain this by saying that's because merit messes things up in that way, breaks out the patterning. But what makes you so sure that it's merit that causes this? Because I gather that what you mean is not just merit, but rather you mean pure merit, merit unadulterated by biases. Otherwise, we'd need to have, by your own argument, some affirmative active remedies. Indeed, you say that at one point you supported affirmative action, presumably at a time when merit would not work purely. But now you seem to think that merit is purely available. The pure merit, is available. So what makes you think that pure merit is available now?
Let me say, I'm happy to answer the question. I just make a brief remark, if I may, as a preface, and that is point out an interesting debating tactic that Professor Wu is using, and that is, we have an opening statement and a rebuttal, and he saves for the end of his rebuttal, when I can't rebut him, all kinds of seemingly inflammatory statements from my book, all of them, by the way, defensible in context, all of them true, even as he stated them, but nevertheless plucked from context, aimed at making me look like an extremist. Why? Not because any of those statements matter, but because he wants to discredit everything else I've said by basically saying, this guy is a bad guy. Don't listen to his sensible arguments. He is a wicked person who believes unconscionable things.
That's a strong point, by the way. Excuse me. I'm sorry. I'm going to stop now and just ask you first to answer the question.
I'm happy to do so. We should think about, when we think about merit, we have to ask ourselves this question. What is a fair race? And we had the Olympics some months ago in Atlanta. To me, a fair race is a race where you draw a straight line, a gun goes off, a clock goes on, first guy who hits the finishing tape gets a gold medal. Now someone could say that's not a fair race. The race isn't rigged by any manifest measure, but not everybody has had equal opportunity. Not everybody has had equal access to coaching. Some guys might have a Nordic track in their basement. Others might not. People might have different access to nutrition. But what I'm saying is, from the point of view of a fair race, none of this matters. A fair race is one in which the same rules apply equally to everybody.
The same rules?
The same rules apply equally to everybody. Now, in the university context, what that means is that colleges can decide what they mean by merit. They can say by merit we mean solely SAT scores. Or they can say, we value the all-round individual. We value SAT scores, but we value grades. If you play chess, if you play the piano, if you've walked around the world, that should count. That's a more rounded definition of merit. All I am saying is, I'm not against a rounded definition of merit. I'm just saying use it in a race-neutral way. Because unlike throwing a football or playing the piano, race in itself is not a talent. I didn't do anything to be born with a brown skin. Why should it count for or against me? Let me give you one example, because we talked earlier about merit. An example about merit producing unequal results is the National Basketball Association. African Americans, who are about 10% or 12% of the population, are 75% of the NBA. Why aren't we protesting that? They are hugely overrepresented. Anyone propose a recruiting program for Asians? Hardly any of us guys out there on the court. But my point is, nobody protests because it's quite clear that merit is producing inequality and not some form of old boy network. And that's all I'm saying. When merit produces inequality in a free society, we should be willing to live with the outcomes, but not in a cold way. Let's ask why, and let's address the root cause of the problem. That's my emphasis.
So your recognition about, your idea about merit then is anecdotal and not empirical in any way?
No, I'm saying that whatever...
Sorry. And in the obvious way. Again, it's pure merit. Pure merit.
I am not saying that it is possible to define merit apart from a context. I'll give you, if you are applying to college, merit obviously has a lot to do with academic skills. If you are applying to be a firefighter, it would be ridiculous to give you a calculus test and say, hey guys, we'll take the guys with the highest scores. And in fact, no one does that. If you go to be a firefighter, what they do is they give you a hose and ask you to run 100 yards. They give you a map and ask you to find a location, presumably because it's helpful to be able to find the fire, And my point is, so I'm saying at various levels, if you look at various types of jobs, there are different measures of merit. And while one measure or another measure may be flawed, it is preposterous to maintain that at every level of society, whether it's reading tests given to a 5-year-old, the SAT, the law school test, the civil service exam, the firefighter test, the police are they all biased? It's ridiculous. Why don't we face up to the fact that people are performing differently and focus on how we can help every group reach its full potential? That's my argument.
Thank you.
The test is a scapegoat.
Thank you. Just very briefly to Professor Wu, I'll ask you first, let's not engage in that discussion about quotations taken from the book. If students want to take that up, of course we can, but I'll ask you not to. The worry I had about Mr. D'Souza's argument is about the coherence of this idea of basing his recommendations on pure merit. But the worry I have about your argument is that you seem, if I understand you, to be basing it on something like pure equality. Sometimes, if there's any such thing as pure equality in a world where people do seem to act differently, produce different outcomes for themselves and their families, part of the reason why they act differently, perhaps, is hoping to produce those different outcomes. And so how can we get a world, I wonder, of pure merit, and the question of pure equality, without constant interference? So here's the question. Sometimes people disagree about social policy because they disagree about what the means are best to some shared end. Other times they disagree about policy because they disagree about the desired end itself. Could you just briefly tell us what the desired end is in your view and what role equality plays in it? What should society look like?
I'd be pleased to do that. Let me begin, though, with an observation, thanking you for your remark, that Dinesh D'Souza engages in an even more unusual debating tactic if you'll recall, what I suggested to all of you was to read his book, not to disregard it. I urge you to read his book. You'll be even more appalled. Let me now turn to the question.
Let me second that recommendation that you do read his books. Go on.
Let me then,
for yourselves.
Agreement on that point.
For yourselves.
Let me then try to answer both the question about means and ends. I believe that in the affirmative action debate, what has happened is we have become confused about means and ends. And we forget that affirmative action is not an ends in itself. It is merely a means. And it is means for me to achieving a society in which we have equality of opportunity, yes, for individuals, but not in the abstract, not in the theoretical sense, but genuine, concrete equality of opportunity for individuals. The irony in Mr. D'Souza's remarks is that he is all too willing to engage in discussion and description of people at the group level. Notice time and again his reference to group disparities, of which he neither approves nor disapproves. He merely presents them as the results of different group preferences. So understand that his objection is not about color consciousness or color blindness. He is quite color conscious. He merely objects when we attempt to remedy the invidious color consciousness with a more constructive, productive color consciousness. And that is where I believe we disagree.
Thank you. I'd like now to open up the floor to you. If you'd like to ask a question, allow me to ask that you ask it briefly, and you take it from the microphone. Please.
Sean Harkin, and a member of the International Socialist Organization. I'll just say a few comments before we get to my question. I was very happy to see the fall of the Berlin Wall. Probably a lot more than you were. And anybody that says we shouldn't protest people like Dinesh D'Souza is obviously an abstraction for what's happening to minorities out there in the real world today. So just to get them a question, that means you protest David Duke, you protest Pat Buchanan, wherever they rear their head. You protest, you know, racist idea, should we have protested Hitler more, so on and so forth. Now, I mean, if you think about Nazism and the Holocaust, right, and the things that it actually, you know, the ideas that were inherent in Nazism about inferiority, the Holocaust completely discredited it, right? That's what, well, this is part of the question.
You have 10 minutes.
Thank you. Cheers. I love the limelight. I love the limelight.
Please ask your question.
I think this is actually important. I think Dinesh, and I would like him to take this up, he's created a new theory that justifies poverty of minorities, particularly blacks, whose condition has actually worsened since the 1960s. You have genetic inferiority, theories of genetic inferiority have been completely discredited because of things like the Holocaust. What you've created is a new theory of inferiority, a culture of inferiority, which is what, you know, you've called it yourself.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Would you like to reply? As you like.
Well, all I can say is that at least I admire your respect for one dead white male, namely Marx, who seemingly still lives here at Brown. But I'm really not sure what you're getting at. I mean, I agree with you that the Holocaust was a bad idea, and if you're engaging in what I call the, you know, reductio ad Hitlerum, in which everything is ultimately sort of linked to Hitler and is therefore proved to be bad, I'm not sure what you're getting at. And then so let me suggest that...
Sorry.
Calling you racist, an open, blatant racist.
Right, but earlier...
I think you should have been kept off this campus in the same way that David Duke should have been kept off this campus, or Pat Buchanan.
Thank you. You've made your view clear. You've made your view clear. Thank you. I think it is clear enough. Thank you. Next question, please. Please.
My name is Luke Morris. I'm not a socialist. I only have a question for you. Once again, this one's for Dinesh.
Excuse me. It does not matter in any way what you are.
Absolutely.
What matters to us? What matters to us? What matters to us is what you say. So
okay,
please.
Here we go. Professor Wu gave us a lot of assertions about how affirmative action works in the military. He didn't tell us how. He told us there's a general guilt that we have to remedy. He didn't tell us how, or didn't tell us why there's a general guilt. He told us that diversity is good at schools, and he didn't tell us why. Now, when you said that affirmative action should not be used as a remedy to inequality, that maybe we should address the inequality elsewhere, one of the interesting points that Professor Wu seemed to kind of be getting at was that if we have affirmative action, then we have white people going to school with black people. Maybe that's good, like maybe, you know, learn how to deal with black people. And so is there any value to affirmative action that way as a remedy?
Thank you. Thank you.
I would put it this way. It is a great mistake to believe that in the absence of affirmative action, you will have no black students admitted to college, let alone no black students admitted to good colleges. It is actually horribly condescending and perhaps even racist to imply that. Now, here is the question. It is a starting point of reality to recognize that if you do have a colorblind policy, the number of blacks or Hispanics at Berkeley may go down from 300 to 60. That's possible. But that brings with it some advantages. One is the 60 blacks who are going to Berkeley can all do the work. They have all met the same standards as every other student. There are no invisible question marks or quotation marks surrounding their achievement. They will graduate in rates comparable to the white and Asian students at Berkeley. And the point is, this will be, to me, a tremendous triumph of black achievement. It is black success that undermines white racism. It is black success that dispels what two writers in the New Republic called rumors of inferiority. So what happens to the other students, the 240 students who don't get into Berkeley? Are these terrible students? No. They are average students. These students have the grades and the test scores to get into UC Davis, UC Irvine, God forbid a community college in California, where they will be evenly matched against their peers and graduate in comparable rates. And so what I'm saying is that Affirmative action has created a mismatch, a ratcheting up effect, in which students are, in a sense, placed in environments where they are not competitive against their peers, and as a result, you have very high dropout rates. At Berkeley, for example, a dropout rate of 50 to 60%. At that point, I subside.
Please respond briefly. I think there are two fallacies contained in that answer. The first is the idea that affirmative action creates the stigma, the rumor of inferiority, as Dinesh D'Souza put it. It is rather, I would suggest, you are a legacy of racial discrimination, racial prejudice that causes that question mark to be placed over every racial minority. It existed before affirmative action. It will exist after affirmative action. The second fallacy contained in his answer is the notion that it is affirmative action which is creating black failure. It is rather, I would suggest, the disregard for the students who are admitted, the lack of proper support programs, the lack of further effort once they are admitted. And that is one of the things, for example, that the military very concretely does well. It has not just affirmative action in its admissions, but it has affirmative action in training and in retention. It takes affirmative action seriously at every level. So the solution here is not to abolish affirmative action in admissions. It is to add further programs which will help primarily African Americans, but in the end, all of us throughout the college system.
Thank you. Please.
My question is for Mr. D'Souza. Mr. D'Souza, I forgot, excuse me, what position you held during the Reagan administration.
Domestic policy analyst.
Domestic policy analyst. I was wondering, in that time, you said you believe that the best way of dismantling, best way of dismantling or equalizing the races is through dissolving, I understand, affirmative action, but you do that through educational means. I was wondering, in all that time, if you had any way of instituting programs such as, better programs, better than Head Start, rather than supporting such programs as exponentially, increasing exponentially the funding to the military, rather than taking those funds, those huge coffers, and perhaps putting them in programs such as Head Start. You were in a position at that time. You maybe had a voice in Washington, and I was wondering, you could have really put your convictions into place, and maybe why you didn't.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. D'Souza?
I think it's a very fair question. If you say that that's not the problem and affirmative action's not the solution, what are you doing about it? Well, a couple of things. In my book, Illiberal Education, I suggested that we could have, instead of race-based affirmative action, socio-economic affirmative action, by which I mean simply that to recognize that there are people in this society, poor kids, but remember, there are poor blacks and poor Hispanics, but there are poor whites and poor Asians. And I said there is no harm in an admissions officer looking at somebody's file and looking at their grades and test scores and evaluating it against the background of disadvantage or hardship that this particular student has suffered. When in the Reagan administration, I can mention two policies, both of which were really frustrated. The first was enterprise zones, and that is to try to develop a revitalization of the inner city by giving businesses tax incentives to relocate to the inner city, something that Democrats in the Congress thwarted. And the other idea is to recognize that the real problem is with the public school system. In Washington, D.C., we have public schools spending $8,000 or $9,000 a student and getting terrible results. We also have Catholic schools spending $1,200 a student and getting better results. So I would suggest voucher programs allowing poor parents to choose which school they send their kids to. That's an important solution, but the unions won't allow it.
Let's stop with that then. So, please, Professor Wu.
If I could respond to that, Dinesh D'Souza's professed enthusiasm for class-based affirmative action makes it clear that there are some preferences which he likes and others which he does not. There are some deviations from meritocracy which he attacks and others which he does not. The question then becomes, why is it that some programs attract such fervent opposition while others go by virtually unnoticed? Let me suggest very quickly, in just 1 minute, 3 such programs. First, every prestigious private university has an alumni preference program in which individuals who otherwise would not be qualified, would not be admitted, are let in merely because their grandfather or father went here. Not only Not only do these programs not create stigma, they create pride for their beneficiaries, as they note proudly that the third generation of their family to have come to this campus, and look over there at that hall, it's named after my grandfather. That is a clear deviation from meritocracy. It benefits overwhelmingly not only whites, but privileged whites whose ancestors went here. And the irony would be, if that were finally abolished, when the day came when racial minorities would be able to benefit. Why affirmative action, but not alumni preferences?
Thanks so much. Thank you. Another question, please.
Yes, this question is for Professor Wu. It's getting back to what you were raising toward the end of your remarks in the response session about means and ends. And I only want to bring us back to it because I think it's at the crux of the debate on affirmative action. About affirmative action is, as you said, a means to an end. And so what I ask you is it okay in developing this ideal society of pure equality that if we agree on affirmative action as a good, as a civic good for America, that in development of this goal, it is okay to uplift, let's say, the clause of equal protection in the 14th Amendment under the law to some whites who might be discriminated against in the process of getting toward this ideal? Essentially, is it okay to violate the rights of an individual in order to achieve, in the achievement of a greater good?
Thank you.
I would answer that question by explaining that I believe affirmative action does not inflict specifically as a form of racial subordination the harm on whites that regular discrimination did on African Americans. It is a fallacy to believe that affirmative action is the moral equivalent of slavery. It is a fallacy because it is not true that affirmative action singles out whites on the basis of race. Indeed, affirmative action, properly practiced, distributes costs. I agree with you. But it does not distribute those costs and those burdens on the basis of race. It confers benefits on the basis of race, but to the extent that it has costs, it distributes them, as I believe Mr. D'Souza would acknowledge, on whites and Asian Americans and anyone else who is not at that point in time with that program a beneficiary. Affirmative action should be done right. It should depend on the context and circumstances, and yes, there are burdens. Those burdens, as long as they're distributed equally throughout society, I believe are worth bearing.
Very briefly.
Let me see if we can unravel that Orwellian doublespeak. Because if all,
briefly.
All right. Two guys apply for a job. The white guy, two guys apply for a job. The black guy is better qualified. The white guy gets the job. That's discrimination. Two guys apply for a job. The white guy is better qualified. The black guy gets the job. That's affirmative action. Now I ask you, what is the real moral difference between these two cases? All I see are two cases of discrimination. Professor Wu wants us to believe that the second case compensates for the first, even though we're talking about four different people. That's the fundamental fallacy of his argument. He is trying to attack discrimination by encouraging it, by legalizing it.
Thank you. Please.
My question is primarily for Mr. D'Souza. Several years ago, the Congress of the United States repealed minority tax breaks for ownership of media properties such as radio and television. The original legislation was drafted in the 70s as a response to a white network, which was deemed almost impenetrable by minorities. In this case, merit plays very little part in what happens. Is affirmative action okay in this case?
Is affirmative action okay in the awarding of the ownership of radio stations? Let me start with this point. In order to buy a radio station, you have to be a multimillionaire. The kind of people who have bought radio stations include people like O.J. Simpson and so on. Here's my point. Do we really need affirmative action for millionaires? I agree. The people who are buying the stations, the whites are millionaires too. But my point is, radio stations are basically auctioned off to the highest bidder, or in the case of contracts, to the low bidder. These low bid systems were established for fairness. And in the Adirond case, the famous Supreme Court case, Adirond was the white company with a handful of employees. Gomez, it was competing against Gomez, a big minority firm. Many times Gomez had the low bid. They got the contract. But even when Adirond had the low bid, Gomez got the contract because Gomez was a minority firm. Now, is that fair? That's what the Supreme Court looked at, and the Supreme Court said, no, that is not fair.
Thank you.
I have a very brief response. Why is it that Dinesh D'Souza objects not when we have an FCC auction system which permits wealthy whites to buy radio and television stations, but only when we add affirmative action to permit blacks to do so? The problem is the auction system itself, which favors the wealthy, not the affirmative action. Second, with regard to government bidding and low bids, take, for example, union contractors. We sometimes restrict competitions to those firms which are unionized, even though a non-union firm might come in with a lower bid. Why? Because there are other societal goals, such as the protection of labor, which we seek to advance. I would humbly suggest that affirmative action does the same thing. It promotes another societal goal in addition to simply the idea of having the low bid.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Okay, this is a question directed at a statement made by you, Mr. D'Souza, but I'd also like Mr. Wu's response, if that's possible, please. My question is, why does it not matter if people come to the race, as you have said many times, usually a running race when you say it in your anecdotes? Why does it not matter, Dinesh D'Souza, if people come to the race with different nutrition, with different coaching, with or without a Nordic track, just to use your metaphors, rather? Isn't that the inherent point of affirmative action, to make the race equal, to let everyone enter the race? Isn't that exactly what matters, sir?
Excuse me, do you work for Nordic Track? Please.
My point was not that it doesn't. My point was not that it doesn't matter that people are coming to the race with different levels of preparation or even ability. It was that fact does not violate the inherent fairness of the race. The Olympics is still fair by giving the medal to the fastest runner. Now, as a social problem, we might step back and say, isn't it interesting that all the 100-yard dashes and the 200-yard dashes and so on have been won, for example, by African Americans? Why aren't whites running faster? Why can't white men jump in the end? And that may be an interesting problem to debate. I'm not saying we shouldn't debate it, but I'm saying the NBA is not unfair for letting the guys play who are the best shooters. We can then ask, do we want to encourage more whites to play midnight basketball? Those are all very interesting questions. But it is wrong to pretend that what we are doing in the attack on merit, and I notice every time Professor Wu says merit, he says so-called merit, or the so-called market, and so on. The reason for this prejudice against merit is it's producing an unsatisfactory outcome. It's like a thermometer. It's registering a temperature of 104. The patient has a fever. Professor Wu's solution, throw the thermometer on the ground. Jump on it a few times. This may make the fever go away. I submit that that is evasion.
All right. I don't follow basketball, so let me offer you two other examples, concrete examples that will demonstrate how membership confers merit in all of our minds. Two simple examples, both empirically true and I don't think would be questioned. Every public university in this country prefers in-state residents in admissions and offers in-state residents tuition breaks compared to out-of-state residents. That is a deviation from merit. It goes unchallenged. It goes unchallenged because we believe it would be ludicrous to say to state residents that they must treat outsiders in the same way that they treat state residents. Second example, at every one of those public universities and on many private campuses, there's a great deal of pressure these days to limit the number of international students. Too many foreign teaching assistants who can't speak English is the claim. Yet that, too, is a deviation from merit. For those are individuals who have the test scores, have the qualifications, have the undergraduate training, can do the work, and indeed, in many instances, were U.S.-born natives would refuse to enter the programs. These are two examples where we clearly deviate from merit, and most people, I would say, if we were to say, well, you must treat foreigners the same way as citizens, would say, wait a minute, that's absurd. We know who belongs and who doesn't, and that's exactly the point. Membership confers merit.
Thank you. Please.
Hi, this question is for Mr. D'Souza. I just have a pretty simple question. Is racism dead in America? Because if racism is dead, then what you're saying is right. We don't need affirmative action. We don't need all these other preferential, as you say, different things like that. But if you can honestly say to this audience and say to the rest of the audience watching on C-SPAN that racism is dead, then I think you'd probably be laughed out of this auditorium here. Now, this is not to attack you or anything like that, but I would just want to know if you think or believe that racism is dead.
I'll answer your question, but may I pose a quick one to you?
Yes.
Is anti-Semitism dead in America?
No, it's not.
And should Brown have preferential programs for Jews?
I wouldn't be against it.
You think that Brown University should have preferential programs to let Jews, to increase the number of Jews in the student body?
I said I wouldn't be against it. Brown is a university that wants to be more culturally diverse.
Let me ask you this. Do people in this society have a prejudice against people who are hugely overweight?
Yes, they do.
And do you think Brown University should have a preferential program to let such people in?
Excuse me. Stay with it. Stay with it. Stay with it. Sorry. Please stay with it.
Yeah.
I'm afraid I have answered it all too well. No, racism is not bad.
Sorry, Mr. D'Souza. Please reply if you'd like.
Wait. You have not answered my question.
I'm going to.
Look, like, you were talking about...
Sorry,
no.
excuse me. Let's just sort of stop for a moment. If you'd like to ask a question now, your last question, please do so.
This is it. You're at the Olympic Games, right? And you're saying how it's all equal. Well, in America, and I hate to say it, but the white man has a 50-yard head start. And affirmative action makes that playing field just a little bit leveler. And if you're saying that racism is dead in America, then you're wrong. And I just want you to answer that question.
Thank you. Thank you.
If I might also respond,
Dinesh, I'll return to you.
I think those of us who support affirmative action must take care to thoughtfully respond to the question posed by Mr. D'Souza about anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
His answer suggests that if you support affirmative action, you must therefore abandon all notions of merit and support all forms of preference. That is not true. Affirmative action is not an all-or-nothing system. I am no more in favor of letting unqualified individuals into this university than Mr. D'Souza is. I am merely saying that each and every one of us has qualifications that don't show up in grades and test scores, and we are more than merely numbers.
Thank you. Mr. D'Souza?
That is the difference.
Thank you. Mr. D'Souza?
Professor Wu's whole argument comes down to this. We have preferences for in-state residents. We have preferences for alumni kids. We have preferences for athletes. What's wrong with preferences based upon race? Earlier he said, these preferences do not confer stigma. Well, I know I went to Dartmouth and we had what was called the athletes' table, at which I saw 350-pound guys eating 12 eggs for breakfast, and I assure you there was the stereotype of the dumb jock. So preference in a non-racial context does confer stigma. Here's another point. I'm against alumni preferences, and I would ask Professor Wu that if he wants to be consistent in defending merit, why don't we agree to have a coalition that would abolish alumni preferences and racial preferences both? But here's my point. He is defending these forms of nepotism, alumni preferences, in-state residences. He's not against them. What he's saying is that you've got all these guys feeding at the public trough. The alumni kids because they have money. Brooke Shields because she's Brooke Shields. Ted Kennedy's son gets into Harvard even though you and I might consider him disadvantaged. Nevertheless, here's my point. Here's my point. He's saying, his argument is that because we have other forms of nepotism or favoritism, why don't we have racial nepotism too? And my point is, I am arguing we want to move away from the nepotistical society. I'm not denying that there are forms of preference. I'm not denying that. But there is a special invidiousness, and the court recognizes this, to racial preferences. If I had a restaurant and I said, no one can eat in my restaurant who doesn't wear shoes, is that legal? That's legal. On the other hand, if I say, no one can eat in my restaurant who's black, that's illegal. That's illegal. And so my point is, race is not the same thing as other forms of preferences. There is, for good historical reasons that Professor Wu himself refers to, a special invidiousness attached to race.
Thank you. Let's just stop briefly. Would you like to reply?
Yes, I would. What I would say is that It's merely an observation that it's peculiar that the forms of preferences which tend to benefit whites don't attract opposition. I decline Mr. D'Souza's offer to start a campaign against alumni preferences because I don't think you could work the public into a frenzy about alumni preferences. And there's an oddity there, I think, that we should reflect on, that it is not the preferences which have a racial impact but which benefit whites, which trouble us, but the other preferences which also have a racial impact, which benefit racial minorities, which trouble us. That inconsistency, I think, is what should bother us about race. Not only that, Mr. D'Souza does not reject the notion of race and its use. He believes that if the free market were to prevail and everyone were allowed to discriminate, things would eventually sort themselves out more or less to his satisfaction, because some of us would discriminate on the basis of a person's being white and others on the basis of their being Asian or black or otherwise. And so things would eventually sort themselves out. And moreover, to the extent that things did not sort themselves out, such discrimination would be rational. That is a rationalization for racism.
Thank you very much. Next question, please.
Yeah, I am a socialist. I'm also South Asian, and I'm not racist, and I'm for affirmative action.
Do you have a question?
Yes, I do.
Let's hear it.
And my question is, you know, Mr. D'Souza, what do you have to say about, I mean, the fact of segregation in society? I mean, whenever you talk about discrimination, you always throw up the question of individuals. Like, you know, a black guy got a job because he was black. Is that right? No. You know, that's what you say. But what you don't say is that a black person born in this society has 60% a chance to be born in the inner cities, has, you know, three times more chance to be poor than whites. I mean, there's the problem of segregation. Affirmative action goes a step towards solving that, whereas dismantling affirmative action goes towards resegregation. And not only that, it comes along with political policy. I mean, this is about politics, not just about academics. It
Thanks
goes
very
along
much.
with
Thank you.
dismantling of welfare, etc.
Thank you. We've had this question before. Would you like to respond just briefly?
Well, I just want to point out that your use of the term segregation is essentially meaningless, because segregation is legal separation required by law. Segregation doesn't mean giving a test to a bunch of people and taking the best guys who win and then saying that's segregation because this group happened to do better than that group. That's not segregation. That's merit.
Thank you. Thank you.
Let me offer a counterexample. Historically black universities and colleges, such as Howard University, where I'm proud to be on the faculty, did not arise simply because African Americans individually or as a group decided they had a choice in the matter. At the time those institutions were founded, they were excluded either in law or, if not in law, equally effectively in practice. And that discrimination persisted until only a generation ago when the 1964 Civil Rights Act was passed. If that act were abolished, as Mr. D'Souza urges, that does not mean we would instantly return to Jim Crow, but it would worsen the racial segregation which persists.
Thank you. Next question, please.
This is a question for both speakers. You have alluded to gender in your discussion, yet not made it a part of this debate. My question is, how would the principles you have stated in this debate change or not change if they were to be applied to gender, which is, of course, part of the affirmative action question?
Who would you like to respond first?
Whoever has an answer ready.
I'll respond first. I think the way that gender has been excluded also tells us something about this debate. Preferences on the basis of gender, and gender preferences altogether, if you were just to tally up the total number of beneficiaries, have benefited more individuals than preferences on the basis of race. But for some reason, gender preferences also don't trouble us in the same way. And I think it's significant that they don't do so. They don't do so, I would suggest to you, because they also benefit whites and white males indirectly. Gender preferences and race preferences are not the same, but there are equally valid reasons to have gender-based preferences, and there I think you can see how the case for affirmative action can be made even stronger. We all recognize that without a single individual who's explicitly, overtly, openly sexist at a company, that company can have a culture which is sexist. And it may indeed have never had women in management and not now have women in management. That is not merely an accident. It is not merely just by freedom of association freely exercised by everyone. It is rather by the practice of gender discrimination exercised by those in power.
Thank you.
Without a single individual who's been doing wrong. That is what affirmative action addresses.
Thank you. Very briefly, please.
It is true, we are more troubled about race preferences than we are over alumni preferences or gender preferences. Professor Wu implies that that's because we're all unconscious racists. Why else would we have this greater moral discomfort? I have a perfectly good reason. We didn't fight a civil war over alumni preferences. Martin Luther King didn't say that he wanted a society where we are judged by the status of whether or not our dad went to Brown. We had a civil war and a civil rights movement over the idea of eradicating race as the decisive factor of law and public policy. And what Professor Wu now wants to do is to put race back into the law and use it as a decisive basis of decision making, and rightly we are morally troubled by that.
Thank you.
It seems that Mr. D'Souza's beliefs on affirmative action are largely based on the idea of a deracinated society in which race doesn't matter, and I would ask you, what about the idea that a deracinated society is a myth? It's ahistorical and simplistic, and there are questions involved in terms of who sets the rules of the game, whose language are we talking in, such as in the culture of business, who sets the values of capitalism. If a boss is looking to promote someone, are they going to promote someone they feel comfortable with? And is that fair for people of color who would have to act white in order to feel comfortable with this boss? And I just want to see how you respond to the idea that all of these questions are inherently racialized, and to pretend that race is not a factor is simplistic.
Thank you. Please.
The reason that colleges and universities introduce standardized tests is to fight the kind of bias that you describe. In the old boy system, you would have the admissions director at Princeton call up the college counselor at Choate or Deerfield and say, "Whom do you have for me this year, Whitworth?" This was the old boy network. Now, a lot of poor Irish and Catholic and Jewish kids who studied in poor inner cities in New York said, "Listen, forget the old boy network. Give us all a test. Let us all take a verbal test, a math test, and take the guys who score the best." That's the fair system. The point is, merit was established to fight racial nepotism. And it's a great irony that the civil rights movement, after championing merit in the 60s, has now come to rediscover the virtues of nepotism. And so you have Professor Wu saying, what's wrong with the alumni preferences? Let's keep those in-state preferences. What's wrong with the old boy network? We just want to be part of it. That's what his argument has come down to, and that's why the civil rights movement has lost the moral high ground.
Thank you.
That's hardly true as a historical matter. If you ask historians of intelligence testing, they will tell you that intelligence testing and standardized testing has its origins in a movement which we have forgotten, a social Darwinist eugenics movement from the late 19th century. And the tests which we use today are a direct descendant of tests which were once used not only against people of color, but also to suggest that white ethnics were illiterate or diseased or unassimilable or not intelligent. That is the historical origin, and I would suggest that that historical origin is significant for intelligence testing.
When you say that these tests were used against groups, I thought they were tests.
They were, but they were tests designed by ideologues who saw that they could be successfully deployed to argue that the reason to prevent Europeans, not just people of color, but Europeans who were a little darker or a little more likely to be Catholic or Jewish from coming to our shores in the 1910s and 1920s.
Well,
part of the basis for movement was the use of IQ tests and other tests to say they were unfit, they were inferior stock.
Thank you. Very briefly.
Well, Professor Wu is deliberately confusing IQ or biological testing with merit standards. Look, I mean, I took the SAT and most of you did too, and so I just leave you with this thought. It didn't seem to me, and I hope it didn't seem to you, that the SAT was devised by the Ku Klux Klan. The point is, these tests are not a measure. The typical question on the SAT is like this. If an automobile can go 70 miles in an hour, how far can it go in 40 minutes? Now, that is not discriminatory.
Thank you. Obviously, we need not only the average question to be like that, but all the questions to be like that. They may or may not be, but that's another issue. I think we'll have one more question. Which side am I on? I've forgotten. It's yours.
I'd like to actually return to this issue of pure merit. Professor Tomasi had asked earlier had mentioned earlier that pure merit, we do not necessarily know whether it's not based on other factors or not.
I merely asked whether
Mr. D'Souza thought that. And you replied using this analogy of a race. And I have two questions concerning this race. Number one, the competitors who arrive at this race, do we see trends in the way in which they're prepared? For example, are there certain ethnic groups which are consistently lacking preparation and thus cannot compete properly? And number two, probably more importantly, what is the purpose of this race? A race is one thing, but a college education is a completely different thing.
I'm sorry, can you just say why you think it's different?
A college education is a right, and yet it is also, in the way in which we look at it today, it is a way to address previous environmental conditions of a person's lifestyle. What I mean to say is, if we believe that certain competitors are prepared unequally, then when they come to this race can actually, they can actually finish first anyways. And that's what a college education can do for someone.
Thank you. Please.
I think there's essentially a fundamental flaw in your argument, which is that you're saying that the purpose of a college, I would have thought that the purpose of a college education is education, but apparently you think it is social justice. Nevertheless, let's say it is social justice. You then go on to say that the purpose of a college education is to enable people who start out behind to finish first. So after rejecting the analogy of a race, you ironically return to it, and you embrace the idea of merit. You are simply saying that you want merit to now be, you want to prepare students who are not well enough prepared to win the race. And I agree with you, they should be prepared to win it. But you don't do that by destroying the fairness of the race. You don't do it by asking students to start on different lines. Only the guy who comes in first will think that's a fair race. Everybody else will feel it has been rigged because it has.
Thank you very much. We'll move now to the final part of our meeting, and that is 5-minute closing remarks by each of our speakers. Professor Wu.
Thank you once again. In this final opportunity to address you, let me begin by saying that I respect Dinesh D'Souza and that he's an able debating opponent. I only wish that he recognized that he too has benefited from the civil rights movement, and that it is this failure on the part of many of us who are privileged to recognize our privileges that lies at the heart of this debate. For this debate is about more than just affirmative action. This debate is about more than just racial justice. This is a debate about social justice broadly conceived, and about what type of society we all wish to live in. And I believe that the notion, the metaphor of a race, of a foot race, is an inapt metaphor, not just for a college education, but for our society as a whole. We are not and should not conceive of ourselves in a race in which there are to be only victors and losers. We should rather conceive of ourselves as sharing in a cooperative task in which we have no choice, in which it is urgent for us to see our common cause and our common ground. And if this is to be derided as a social experiment or as social justice run amok, or as the effort by some idealists to impose their ideas on others, so be it. I think it is better that we do something than that we do nothing. And the attempts to abolish affirmative action would bring us back to an era where we as a society, with our government and the other tools at our disposal, did nothing. Colorblindness is a noble ideal. It is something which I believe all of us agree we should work toward. But as we work toward colorblindness, let us remember that it is race to which we should be blind, not racism. There is another debate going on in our society today that I think is instructive to set alongside the affirmative action debate. That is the immigration debate. If you look at the movement to close the borders, you see all too quickly and all too clearly that many who proclaim themselves to be avid believers in colorblindness when it comes to attacking affirmative action soon show themselves to be quite willing to be highly color conscious in closing the borders, in closing the doors on further generations of new immigrants, people such as myself and Mr. D'Souza and all of us in this room. When we put these two debates side by side, we see that these notions of colorblindness and merit, no matter how appealing, no matter how seductive they may be in theory, and when articulated finely as arguments in debates, that they are just political ploys, that in reality, they are pulled out and used to attack affirmative action, but not to attack other preferences which deviate from merit, to attack affirmative action, but not to attack regular racism, to justify policies which have not only maintained but worsened the gap between haves and have-nots. And by stirring up feelings of racial self-solidarity and competition among racial groups, we only worsen the situation, because then we encourage people to believe, and whites especially, to believe that it is every person for himself and everyone's racial group above all else. It is rather by seeing that we have a struggle before us, and that affirmative action, while imperfect, is at least something in which we can cooperatively work together to address these problems of racial discrimination. Ask yourself again, what alternative would you offer? What alternative put in place before affirmative action is abolished will we collectively demand from our politicians, so that we know that their vague promises are not just campaign promises, so that we know that they too share in this vision of genuine equality of opportunity for all individuals? When Martin Luther King wrote his letter from a Birmingham jail, he wrote that we are first and foremost American citizens, and that we are here today to claim our citizenship to the fullness of its meaning. And we do so because of our strong belief that democracy transformed from thin paper to thick action is the best form of government on earth. Those are sentiments that I think are equally apt today. And it is when we have all achieved our citizenship to the fullness of its meaning that I will be satisfied. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. D'Souza.
Well, I knew that in agreeing to come to Brown, I would be stepping into the lion's den. But I'm delighted all of you came out. I appreciate the invitation. I appreciate the civility of your remarks. And I'm very grateful for this invitation. On one point, Professor Wu is quite right, and that is that I am, and many of us are, beneficiaries of the civil rights movement. And it is true that without the victories of that movement, the principle of equality of rights under the law would not be secured. There is really no debate about that proposition. What we are debating now is, should we take the principle of equality of rights under the law that is enshrined in the 14th Amendment, legislated in the Civil Rights Act of '64, and essentially change it, repeal its color blindness, repeal the notion that we are all created equal under the law, and replace it with some are more equal than others. However good are reasons for doing that, throughout this debate, Professor Wu's whole case hinges upon a distinction that he himself made earlier. He said there is no moral equivalence between invidious discrimination and constructive discrimination. We often hear the phrase benign discrimination. It's not intended to hurt anyone. And what I want you to think about is, what is benign discrimination? Isn't it true that all discrimination is benign to the guy who benefits from it? All discrimination is invidious to the guy who must pay its price. And what I'm trying to say is that there is no such thing as benign discrimination. Either we try to eradicate race consciousness and race-based decision-making, or we make our peace with it. Now, someone said earlier, we have to make our peace with it. Race matters. Race matters, and we have no choice but to legislate it. It is a reality that we live in a race-conscious society. Now, think about the logic of that. Imagine if you were at Brown a pacifist, and you came to this forum and made this argument. I am a pacifist. I believe that violence is awful. I believe that violence is wrong. But I note that we do not live in a non-violent society. There are people killed on the street, there are muggings, there are attacks, there are wars all over the world. And since we live in a violent society, since violence is a social reality, I feel I have no alternative but to go out and kill some people. This would be odd. It would be odd to try to promote the principle of nonviolence by engaging in violence. So how do we promote the principle of non-discriminating? By discriminating. That is the fundamental issue. I would suggest that what we want to do is recognize that the civil rights movement made its progress, but we now want to move on to greener pastures, by which I mean what we want to do is recognize that America does have a scarred past. This doesn't mean we have to be captive to the past or chained to it. It means what we've got to do at some point is recognize that today is the first day of the rest of our lives. Americans have supported affirmative action policies for the better part of a generation. And I don't deny that those policies have done some good. All policies do. But at some point, it's important to say that we have a younger generation, all of you. You have come to Brown. Maybe you have benefited from affirmative action, maybe I have. But now I ask you this. You've got a wonderful education at Brown. Many other kids who go to public schools or don't go to college don't have it. So what? You're now going to tell me that when you apply for a graduate school, you want another preference? And another preference when you apply for a job? And another one when you apply for a government contract? Just because you are Hispanic or female? Isn't that ridiculous? Isn't it time to say you have had a wonderful opportunity at Brown, take advantage of it, and now compete on your merits? That's what I'm asking. Take advantage of your opportunities. The alternatives, what are they? They are that we emphasize better schools. It is that we emphasize socio-economic remedies, if you will. Professor Wu says, I'm inconsistent. I support socio-economic preferences, but I don't want racial preferences. Well, socio-economic preferences are widespread in society, and I think are widely accepted for good moral reasons. Welfare is a good example of a socio-economic program. Disproportionately, maybe Hispanics and blacks get welfare, but the fact is, if you're poor and you're white, you get it too. Now, most Americans can live with the fundamental fairness of that, even if they think there should be a transition from welfare to work. My point is our tax system discriminates according to ability to pay. If you're poor, you pay at a lower rate. That's not inconsistent, and you can't say that it is inconsistent to be for that and to be against discrimination. So I leave you with this note. We are at a turning point, and the choice facing our society is, shall race consciousness and race be embedded in the future in our public consciousness and in our laws, or should we work with good moral reasons to eradicate race and bring us some steps closer to the colorblind society. Thank you very much.
So, the speakers have offered to remain behind afterward to answer questions. Mr. D'Souza would also be happy to sign copies of his book. Before this... Well, sorry, excuse me, sorry. Before this debate began this evening, the organizers of the debate said to me that their hope was that you would take from this experience ideas that you will continue debating. I have no doubt that you will. It is considered a gross and unpardonable breach of etiquette for a moderator to say who, in his opinion, won the debate. I'm going to do that. Because to me, at least, it seems obvious regarding at least one of the debates we've been conducting this evening, who won? You won. Thank you.
American Perspectives continues in a moment with Republican Congressman J.C. Watts of Oklahoma. If you'd like a VHS videotape of this or any American Perspectives program, call 1-800-C-SPAN 98. The cost is $31.95, including shipping and handling. Every Saturday night at 8, American Perspectives brings you a look at